Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, Making Education Work Across the Globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hi.
And we're delighted, really honoured, actually, to welcome to our show, Bennie Kara. Hello, Bennie.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a real joy. Now, a lot of people will know who Bennie is, because Bennie is someone that you encounter in the Twitter world. And if you've got a copy of this excellent book we're going to talk about later, Diversity in Schools. Bennie is deputy head of a big comprehensive school in the Midlands in England. And for people in the US, you may have encountered her in a number of different ways. But for me, I first came across you, Bennie, when I saw you do a talk, which was part of an English teacher's sort of webinar, where you talked about how you felt when you were at school, you hadn't seen yourself kind of reflected back to you in the text that you were asked to read. And you talked about it with such passion. It really moved me. I kind of welled up when you were talking. It was very powerful. It was a very strong kind of from the heart kind of talk. And then subsequently I asked you to do a curriculum masterclass, which was just absolutely outstanding. And that's a very, you laid out this whole case. And since then, I'm delighted that you have put some of the ideas from that masterclass into our most recent walkthroughs book. So I'm going to quickly flash it up now, because I'm super chuffed about this. For me, it really is. It's so exciting to have this strong thing. We'll talk about some of the detail in a minute, but it's just been great to sort of see you, meet you online, if you like, and then hear ideas coming through and go from there. So, I mean, what's your working world like at the moment? Are you doing a lot of work around diversity and so on, or are you too busy doing the day job as well?
I'm trying to juggle them both, to be honest. I have this kind of overarching sense of ambition, and feel like I should be able to do it all. So therefore, I do try. So it's in some ways I've been doing a lot more diversity work because everything has moved online, and so the ability to get into a school has become a hell of a lot easier in the last few months, or in the last year, in fact. So, doing loads of training for individual schools, for English departments, for large MATs, for city councils, and, doing my day job during the day. So I've been trying to fit it all in. I think once I go back to work after shielding, I think it will become slightly more difficult to do it, kind of the day job being actually physically in a building. But that won't stop me from trying and cram it all in. So, watch this space. Wither away.
What's the thing that you're asked to talk about more than anything then? Do people just sort of have this sense that we should be doing something about diversity, help, and then they just call you, or are they more focused than that?
It really varies. I mean, most of the time people want a starting point, and they see the book as a starting point. They've read the book and they say, can we have a bit more detail, particularly on the curriculum? So, the specialism really is the curriculum aspect of this work. There are lots of people doing diversity work that's far more kind of broad ranging around, what happens in school structures and systems, whereas I'm thinking purely about content a lot of the time. So, there are people who come and say, look, actually we've identified we have a need to talk about language, diversity. What kind of language should we be using in schools? Or they'll say very specifically, can you come and speak to our English department? Because I've done a lot of work with the English and Media Centre and with Nate and with Late as well. So, it does vary, and I'm happy to try to make it what it needs to be for people. I don't think one size fits all in any kind of sphere of our work. So, yeah, it's.
So what are Nate and Late? Just explain those to me.
The National Association of Teachers of English and the London Association of Teaching English, and the English and Media Centre, the EMC, kind of the big English organisations in the UK. And I was awarded an award by Nate recently. I'm going to take this out here and show you. It is officially a murder weapon.
Oh my God.
I could kill people with it. No, it will hurt. So yeah,
congratulations. That's well deserved. That's excellent.
Thank you. So yeah, I've now managed to knock over everything on my shelf. So I'm just going to put this back. propping everything up. So yeah, you know, I am an English teacher by trade, and you know, all of this started with me thinking about the English curriculum, and I'm slowly learning about the nuances of other subjects and how, you know, we can think about diversity in a meaningful way in, you know, science or maths or PE. And that's a brilliant journey, you know, like as somebody who loves to learn, I'm finding out so much. It's great as a line manager as well. You know, you go to your science teachers and say, look, actually, I know X, Y, and Z about these people that you teach.
That's fantastic. No, well, congratulations. Honestly, I just think it's wonderful to see it kind of I feel like your star is rising, you know, and it's because you have this way of connecting to people, and you're kind of taking people from where they are and saying, let me show you what else you can do, in a way which is practical but also sort of profoundly kind of, you know, ethically driven. It's like it matters, but it's not sort of weirdly impossible. And I think that's quite a neat trick to make it feel to people like, yeah, we can do this. That I want to do it, and here's how. So I think you've done amazing work around that. So Emma, let me hand over to you. How did you come across Bennie?
Oh, well, I'm initially on Twitter, but Bennie's actually been doing some work in our trust as well, with our central team and sort of our broader teams as well. So I have had the pleasure of seeing Bennie in action with our central team, and her session was just amazing. And the things that have kind of developed as a result of the work that Bennie's done with us are absolutely unbelievable. We've now got a diversity consultative group with the 9 protected characteristics all represented on this group, and every aspect of our trust work now kind of goes through the filter of this group, and none of that would have happened necessarily as coherently without Bennie's steer on that. So I can't thank her enough really for the work that she's done with us. But one of the things that jumped out of the book when I read it, and it's just a short little thing where it says, no one person is purely one thing. And I would not do that justice to explain that, but I'd just really love to hear you explain what's meant by that, because I just think it's so powerful, and it was a real learning point for so many people that I work with as well. I'd just love to hear you kind of explain what you mean by that.
It really comes from, I guess, the founding of Diverse Ed. You know, we had this amazing kind of this wellspring of grassroots movements in education. When we, you know, the inception of Women Ed and BAME Ed and LGBT Ed, and then Disability Ed as well. And, you know, as somebody who wanted to be involved and found it, you know, hugely important to have these conversations. I was sat there as an Asian woman who is bisexual, who goes Asian and female, and also kind of recently discovered I had a hearing impairment as well. And I was thinking, you know, how many bits of me have I got to go around all of these grassroots conferences? And I spoke to Hannah Wilson at the time, and we were working together. And I said, look, you know, what about this intersectional space? What about the overlaps? How is that something that we need to you know, how do we negotiate that? And so that's how Diverse Ed came about. And it wasn't really to replace any of those movements. It was very much to provide a conversation around what happens when you carry these multiple protected characteristics. And, you know, I've always said, I'm not playing, I've got more victim cards than the next person. And I think that's how sometimes it gets into this kind of, you know, how many hats are you wearing? Are you more disadvantaged than I am? You know, it's not really about that, but my needs are very different to somebody else's. You know, how people negotiate me and my identity will be different to the way they negotiate with you and your identity. And we are not purely one thing. So many of us fit into so many different categories, and I like to think about it like we think about children. You know, when we think about equitable treatment, we think about fairness. We take children from their starting point and we mitigate for disadvantage. We consider their individual needs. We adapt our processes. You know, we find ways to stitch them into what we're doing, and I think it's the same for adults. And you know, how we treat each other as professionals. So, you know, we are not one thing, but I think it's important to remember that this isn't new. This isn't a new concept. it's something that, especially as teachers, we've always thought about. We just now need to think about it in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion for when it comes to protected characteristics.
I mean, it's interesting to me. Sometimes I think it's interesting you're saying it's not new. I mean, when I first came into teaching, well, I worked in Wigan for a while, where I remember it was in the late 80s, going to a session where they wanted to run a session on racism in the local authority, and some of the teachers in my school said, "Well, what's that got to do with us? Everyone here is white," and I was quite shocked by that. That was the kind of attitude. But then it came down to London. I went to Holland Park School, and it was like people talked about race and every single day. I mean, it was like an extraordinary place, but weirdly, we kind of forgot to talk about achievement at the same time. It was literally almost like, almost felt like, and this has a caricature, but it almost felt like these poor children are disadvantaged. Let's let them off doing any hard tests, because how would you like it if it was almost like that. And we think, my God, it's like that kind of, people talk about apologists for failure and stuff. That literally what it was like. And so you think, well, these things, people have been talking about these things for a long, long time. But we haven't got it right, have we? Because you can see, why do you think we're still, it's such an important issue now, with a kind of urgency about it, even though, as that report that came out last week says, apparently we don't even have a problem. Some people, what's going on, do you think? Because, I mean, there are plenty of people who think we need to do so much, and other people think, hey, come on, we're doing okay. So where do you feel we are on that?
I think there's, certainly been progress since when we were at school or when we first started our teaching careers. I'm not suggesting that, the work that was done in the 80s was pointless. I think it moved the conversation forward inevitably. These things, either badly done or well done, will move the conversation forward. And so there was a place for that. I remember there being a huge push on texts that had characters from different backgrounds. We had some of our kind of texts that we were still teaching in the early 2000s came from that movement. So I do think, there was some real value in that. But as teaching has evolved, our ideas on diversity, equity, and inclusion have evolved. I remember having a sticker given to me at school saying, all different, all equal. And I would say, look, we have a better understanding of what equity means now, about the idea of fairness rather than equality. So I think that's where we are. I mean, why haven't we moved on? Because I think there is still a fundamental misunderstanding of what structural barriers are, and how to negotiate those. And obviously, the report that we dare not speak its name has compounded that. It sort of kind of surprises me and doesn't surprise me. I kind of could have predicted what was going to come out of that report. But that failure of understanding about what structural racism is and what structural barriers are, until we get that right, until we have an understanding of what those are and how to mitigate for those, that's when, that's the point where we'll start to make some real progress. And unfortunately, we are in a situation where that's being denied. And there's some really quite insidious arguments around it. And that's, I was quite depressed, spent a few days kind of moping, and then decided just to carry on, because that's what we all do. We just carry on. Yeah.
So what's your sense of it? I mean, we've discussed you before, Emma and I, because you come on.
I listened.
I know. We were sort of getting excited. So, Emma, what's your sense of how of progress and how things are going? And what do you think?
I mean, I don't know whether primary's just been in a slightly different bubble because of the age of the children and their ability to articulate things at a particular age, and they haven't necessarily had the same kind of experiences that a teenager may have had with their peers. But I think that primary, in the last couple of years, the conversation around diversity has accelerated at a pace that I have not seen before. Mm. And I think there was probably a wrong assumption that primary was lovely and cuddly and everything was fine there. And it wasn't, it really wasn't. And I think that the way the discussions around diversity and equity have accelerated have been brilliant, and they have enriched the curriculum. They have meant that our schools have made huge strides. I mean, I'm lucky enough to work with Halil Tamgumash, who talks about this a lot as well. He's a head teacher in our trust. And, you know, the pace of change that is happening in primary is amazing now. And I think that it's long overdue, to be perfectly honest, that although we may not have experienced some of the more extreme experiences that students may have had who are older, didn't necessarily mean that it wasn't happening. But I think that, it's definitely moving at a pace. I mean, what I've been teaching 23 years now, I've never seen the conversation move this quickly. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that you say in the book, Bennie, is about it can be really complex and daunting to start that conversation if you don't feel you're in a space to start that conversation. So I love the fact that this book is a toolkit for giving you the language, the question starters, the discussion openers. I think it's such a brilliant toolkit for people who want to make a change but don't necessarily know how to or where to start.
Yeah, well, I think that was it. You know, the intention behind the book was always, could a teacher pick it up and have something to do the very next day? You know, and we were very deliberate about the audience, and the fact that it was never intended to be this kind of academic treatise on, you know, all of the research and all of the kind of you know, the nuances around decolonization. And it was very much a starting point. And I appreciate that some people, you know, will look at it and go, well, actually, I know all of that. I'm at a completely different point, in which case, you know, they know what they're doing. But I like the fact that people have said, you know what, I feel better about how I'm approaching it. I feel better about, you know, some of the ideas that I had, because it's kind of been validated by the book. And I think when people feel comfortable and when they feel supported, like there's a safety net somewhere, they're more likely to go and take risks. And sometimes that means somebody standing next to you going, here, look, there's a book that says, actually, you know, you should be doing exactly this. So that's been my proudest moment of all of this. It's how many people have come back and said, thank you. You know, I didn't know where to start, but I feel like I've got a safe place to start now.
It's really empowering to have that. And when you say about it can't be done by individuals alone as well, going with this, you've got so many voices in here to go along with to start that conversation. So it's a hugely empowering tool for people who want to make change in their organisation. So thank you.
I think the idea that I feel, for me, which I know you don't own it, and you'll say so in a second, but it's just that I've taken, and it's just, I feel it's like a light bulb moment really, is this idea of utilizing diversity as a kind of a way of dealing with it for people, because, and the need, the imperative to kind of challenge victim narratives as a dominant kind of narrative for all sorts of different groups of people. Mm-hmm. And you express that so well. And when I've shared that with other people, I just think that's so interesting, isn't it? So you don't sort of, and it came up earlier this year when Black History Month was on again. And there's this quite interesting debate about whether that's a good idea or not, because on the one hand, it's better than nothing. Yeah. On the other hand, it's sad that you need it. And the idea that Black History Month should be sort of Black history curriculum and kind of ever present. So it isn't like, hey, let's talk about Black history now, and as if we wouldn't normally. So that to me is interesting, and you express it really well in the walkthrough. But just tell us about this utilizing diversity concept and where it came from.
So the term itself was taken from a lady called Sue Sanders, who co-founded LGBT History Months, probably when I was still at nursery school, and you know, at a time when it was really not okay to be gay and be out in schools. And she's been supporting LGBT educators for decades, and it was taken from her, and actually came third hand to me via some training that I did, that I went to, and so heard the term there. But it really, like you said, it was like a light bulb moment for me as well, and this idea of, you know, taking the word normal. You know, normal seems like such an innocuous word, and yet it exists in this space that is an entirely binary. You know, there's normal and abnormal, and, you know, or normal or not normal. And this kind of concept that, you know, when you have normal, you have things that deviate from the norm. So immediately you've got this sense of a kind of in group and out group, which, looking at kind of Hegelian philosophy, is is kind of natural to us, and we've always done it. But if the aim is to try to create that sense of belonging, and I often talk about belonging rather than diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that those exposure to difference, exposure to variation, exposure to lifestyles that are kind of outside of your experience, that the usualized experience is what will create a kind of more seamless understanding of who we are as human beings. And to me, it makes perfect sense. I don't want to know like what's normal and what's normal. I just want to feel like actually in our society, it is usual to see a family that looks a certain way, to see couples that look a certain way. Or to have people with lots of different religious ideas kind of coexisting. And I'm not kind of like completely idealistic about this. I understand about our innate human kind of nature, in the sense that we are tribal as human beings, and there's lots of studies that show that babies make selections of people who look very similar to them very, very early on in their lives. However, maybe there is a kind of utopian in me a little bit, because I think this, if we are bombarded by images of kind of usualized diversity, that somehow actually those children going out in the world will not see difference in the way that perhaps our generation sees difference. So that's the wildly important goal in all of this, to fundamentally transform the way people think via the medium of the curriculum.
Well, it's not like we want to eliminate difference or anything, is it? It's like it needs to, like the whole thing of utilizing it, differences are there, they're part of who we are. And but I do think that's so powerful. And it means, I remember when my daughter was at primary school, that she had there's a boy in her class who had two moms, and that was just so normal, because it's just one of those things that's part of life. And you always think, but where people don't encounter things which are usual, then there's a kind of, you get ignorance and prejudice, and you have to sort of, as a school, kind of inject things which are maybe not naturally present in the community, and that can be a kind of difficult.
Yeah.
But I'm going to come to some of the suggestions that you've got in there, but I just sort of hand over to Emma now. Like is that something that you've thought about, that you usualize? Is that a phrase that we use in your schools, do you think?
Yeah, we're starting to use it a bit more. But it goes alongside, for me, that bit that you write about, Benny, about expanding the parameters of knowledge and culture. So it's not about a replacement culture. Mm-hmm. It's not about sort of saying, well, let's remove this and put that in there instead. It's actually, let's just add that breadth, add that richness to the conversations that we have. And by doing that, usualizes everything. And so a real learning point for me has been the whole kind of expansion, depth and breadth, rather than an enforced replacement of something. So that's been absolutely fantastic. And it's like you're saying, Tom, about your children. I was trying to explain, I was on a walk with my children this morning, and one of my eldest, who's 10, was asking me about autism. And so I started having this conversation about neurodiversity, and her take on it was so just, well, this is just, some people are like this and some people are like this, and we're all, and I was just thinking, this is so refreshing. And I wish, like you, Benny, everybody could have that mindset of like a 10-year-old of like, oh, well, sometimes it's like this and sometimes like that, and sometimes it's in the middle. So very refreshing. Anyway, Tom, what were you going to say?
Well, look, here's the thing. So this is the thing where I just slept on this. I just thought, because anything which comes in sort of fives, I just think, oh, great, walkthroughs. So I should write, but I was going to flash it up again because I just think it's a visual feast. If people are watching this on YouTube, and you should, it's on page 58 if you really want to zone in. Weirdly, that's the same as the other reference in the other book as well. There's something about that. I know. And so I'm going to read out the 5 things which I just think are fantastic. So diversity, ways into curriculum building. So one of them, expand the universe. Secondly, highlight parallel stories. Thirdly, map migrations. Fourth, diversify faces. And fifth, counter dominant narratives. Now, each one of those is just a punchy, actionable thing for a school. And I just think just think about like parallel stories. That's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's not like, oh my God, we haven't got time, like Emma was saying, replace. Actually, nearly every time there's a dominant narrative that we're familiar with about, a war or literature or a science story, there is a parallel story, which is there for the taking, and you just need to take the time to weave it in. But in terms of curriculum time, it doesn't really take any longer, does it? It just needs to be there. I mean, what do you have a favorite example of that you use for people?
Yeah, I mean, a classic example I use in my training is the stories we tell about World War One, and we focus on trench life and we focus on trench warfare and the experiences of white British soldiers in France. And actually, you don't have to look too far. In fact, you just have to Google Sikh World War One soldiers to see that there's a wealth of information, diaries, letters, poems, images about the contribution of Sikh soldiers to the war effort. And there's no reason why we can't put those stories together. There's nothing that says you only have to concentrate on the experiences of white British soldiers in World War One. If the narrative we're saying, with the narrative that we are presenting to our students is very much around, look, these are the contributions from our kind of global cultures, then it's a really simple thing. And neither of those things has weight. And so for me, it's one of the most powerful strategies we can use, because it allows us to decenter kind of narratives of power. What culture is more important, what story is the one that we're going to tell, because we're telling both stories and we're saying they're equally as important as each other.
Yeah, and that's just and I think that sounds so natural, isn't it? And then in terms of the utilizing, when you're you enter that curriculum, you don't put a giant ring around it and say, hey, look at this interesting. It's just, you have to think, no, utilize it, make it just as it's just a part of the curriculum. It's not a special place. It's just there like everything else is there. And so you encounter it with a kind of neutrality. And I think there's a power in that. But I think even when people are so pleased with themselves, perhaps that they've found it, they're going to be, you can I don't know. I think there's a way of doing it which is more subtle. And then this one I think is interesting, counter-dominant narratives. So there is such a strong tendency, isn't there, to talk about victim stories, and because let's face it, some terrible things have happened to people because of their, whether it's Turing or slavery, or they're absolutely, these are atrocities. But of course, you have to, if that's the only time you're talking about diversity, it just is a false picture, isn't it? So
yeah,
how do you, what's your recommendations to people there?
I think it's that thing, when you map the narrative of a people or of a characteristic across your curriculum, and the only time they are referred to is through that lens of victimhood, then the message that the schema a child is building around those people is fundamentally flawed, and certainly kind of very, very kind of tunnel in its scope. And I'll use my own childhood as an example. Bear in mind, I would classify myself as East African Asian. My 2 generations of my family born in East Africa, and yet the images I was exposed to of Africa at school were very much around the kind of charity campaigns of the Sudan, and so you would have the starving child image. And the only time I saw Africa reflected, on a screen or in a textbook was the idea that people were starving. And I didn't get a sense of what a city looked like in Africa. I didn't get a sense of the history of Africa, as opposed to, unless it was to do with like colonization. And I certainly didn't get a sense that, Africans were business people or, doctors. It was all one narrative. It was much old. I was much older when I started to kind of see different images of what Africa meant. And so I think it's really important to consider what the dominant narratives are in our particular subjects. So, very much thinking in terms of Africa, what happens in geography? What do kids see in geography? What do they see in assemblies when it comes to charity work? But it's true in science as well, around kind of certainly women in STEM. I think that's probably the easiest example. When we map who the named scientists are in a science curriculum, they tend to be white men. And we've got to ask ourselves the question of, well, if we are showing that science is universal, that it's something that we've all contributed to in some way, shape, or form, why are we only naming these people? The act of naming people in our curriculum suggests that we think they're important. And it's the same in history. Who are the named people in your history long-term plans? And you'll start to see the patterns. And those are the dominant narratives that our children pick up. And so in some ways, we are reinforcing the inaccurate information they're receiving from society by kind of providing that narrative in schools. And so actively countering them, actively saying, no, we're going to put in perhaps a greater number of women than we initially would have, or a greater number of women into our history curriculum, maybe shift the focus so that we don't inadvertently send the message that history doesn't have any women in it, or science doesn't have any women in it. It's a small shift in thinking. What are the dominant narratives in my subject?
I think even I'm a physics sort of person, and there's a classic. In fact, I actually think it's quite an epic picture in many ways, which is the classic Solvay conference from the 1920. Well, I'm going to get it wrong now. Mid 1920s, and it's got just all the physicists that have sort of units named after them and particles and stuff are all there. It's incredible collection of people. Schrodinger, Einstein, they're all there, and Marie Curie.
Yeah, yes, Marie Curie.
And she's the only one that's not. She's the only one in that Solvay photo who's not a white man. But I do think there is a kind of context to that. So you could sort of say, look, isn't this amazing, this picture? But what's obvious about it? And you can sort of use it to deconstruct that situation and say, absolutely, why were they all white men? And then I think more contemporary, like more modern scientists now, like, people from astronauts and discovering, people who are active in science now are way more diverse than they would have been in that profession in 100 years ago.
It's the classic idea that you have your substantive knowledge in your subject, that of your subject, and I think some of this diversity work relies on us interrogating the disciplinary space. So really kind of asking about why we've chosen the information and the knowledge that we have. Why are these people foregrounded and highlighted? Because if we kind of think about science more broadly, and certainly the history of science, we skip over kind of the Middle East quite epically. The amount of contribution to medicine and astrology and maths, kind of scientific endeavor that happened in the Middle East, but actually that's not part of our narrative. Maybe because we don't go far back enough, because we kind of start Enlightenment thinking and we assume that that's where it all started and that nobody was thinking rationally before then. And actually that's definitely not true. So I think part of countering dominant narratives is allowing some space in our curriculum for that disciplinary thinking around our subjects to really think about why certain things are dominant and why certain things aren't.
Yes, it's great stuff.
Is that picture you're on about the one where every single person in the picture ended up going on to win the Nobel Prize?
Nearly. I think they nearly all have, but
which kind of made me think about something you say in the book, Benny, about you've got to be invited into the right spaces, and it's how we invite more people in. And then I was just mentally contrasting that with an interview I saw on the television the other day about the European Space Agency and the European Space Programme, where I think it's 70% of their STEM workers on that project now are women. And I'm just contrasting that mentally with that image of those physicists versus the European Space Agency project. I was just having a little flight of fancy there.
Yeah, and we could talk about this endlessly. For me, you could probably take the names of the people out and just talk about the ideas of particle physics, and they were to be found. But this is a time when women were not even allowed to vote. Everybody, so it's like it's an extraordinary. I feel like there's a kind of, you can get kind of into you can't. You've got to explore the history and the context, and you've got to sort of deconstruct it. But it's an opportunity to do that, rather than saying, "Let's imagine that didn't happen." And then sort of thinking, I do think a bit like, at least you have to evaluate it, don't you? Like, what's it like to be a black student sitting in a class where all the scientists represented are are white men, and not to feel that therefore that is related to you. But I think teachers need to bridge that and show, well, the ideas are universal. The fact that magnets repel is a feature of the universe. It's nothing to do with
exactly
Faraday. It's like a property of the universe we all inhabit, and no man owns that. I think that's
right. But I do think there's something uniquely powerful in showing students about some of the early thinking around science and how these ideas around, magnetics didn't come from, one group of people either. There's a narrative behind that as well, where people were, inscribing things on stone around some of these ideas way before the Enlightenment, and to know that you're part of that story, that your people are part of that story. It's what I spoke about in the Team English National Conference keynote. Was all I want to know is that I'm part of the story. I don't want to know that I created the story. I don't want to know that like my involvement is more important than anyone else's. But I want to feel present. Like there's a possibility that I could perhaps contribute in some way as I grow older. And I think our children need that because, I talk about kind of tribalism a lot and that feeling of like disappearing into your group identity. And to mitigate for that, we need to feel like we're part of a story. Stories are universally powerful. And our subjects do tell a story.
I do think as well that primary practitioners are uniquely placed to make those links so beautifully because they're not kind of squirreled away in a single subject or single department, that actually you've got the potential to create this really rich tapestry where you can do those comparisons and bring in all of that in one room, in one space with the same group of children all day. I think it's a hugely kind of brilliant position to be in as a primary practitioner, to have that kind of bird's eye overview of that, how you can curate the children's experiences in school. So I'm not saying it's easier to do in primary, but there's definitely a real potential there for real rich work with our youngest learners, which may be slightly more simple to enact than when you're dealing with multiple disparate departments in a secondary setup.
It has to be a foundational knowledge on all of this, and just like we have with all, kind of all our understanding of what our subjects are, that foundational knowledge of your subject might also be, look, these are the contributions that lots of people made, and then you get to revisit that at secondary school or at A level, because it is important to revisit that information in the context of a child growing up and having a better understanding of the world that they live in, and perhaps some of the structural things that occur as you grow older. But I certainly think primary is absolutely right. And I work in a 3 to 19 school, so it's it's something that I'm learning about, and I'm fascinated by how much information primary children get, and kind of sort of astounded by it, to be honest.
I think this thing of visualizing is so key. So, I mean, one of the things that you it's funny when you do it, you talk about the sort of the shrine to black scientists in the corner of the science lab, and it's sort of it's got a kind of bow on it, but it's not integrated and it feels separate rather than part of something. And that's such an important thing to get right. And one of the things I wanted to reference in talking to you was it's in your book, A Diversity in Schools. You quote Diogenes Laertius.
Yes.
I don't know what the period is. Who says, "I am a citizen of the world." That's the quote. And for me, global citizenship is one of those sort of phrases which gets trotted out and stuck on a badge and put on your values statement. But making that a reality, wow, that is so profound, isn't it? The idea if children really felt that, and it would inform their sense of responsibility for the environment and for each other, and how ethnic boundaries are sort of ever blurring, and we're all human. So, but you give some specific things, and you talk about some things like exchange programs, pen pals. I mean, do you think those sorts of tangible things are really can make a difference, like to do something like actually reaching out and talking to people from other countries and so on?
I genuinely think that, we've actually got worse at kind of reaching out and talking to people from different countries. But, certainly when I was at school, and I talk about this in the book, that, we went to France and we kind of had this time with some French students who probably had never encountered as many Asian people as they had, as they did in that time, and possibly completely changed their understanding of a culture they wouldn't normally be exposed to. And just recently I was watching, there were TV programs, all sorts of things like Indian Summer School, where 5 boys were sent to a very strict boarding school in India, and that culture shock inevitably kind of leads to this realization about kind of different cultures, and I don't think we have that enough in schools, and ironically we are more connected across the planet than we've ever been, and yet we don't make space for these things, certainly in schools with high levels of disadvantage. And I think we've got to remember that there are different experiences for different kids in the UK, where there is a little bit more advantage, there's space in the curriculum to have international exchange programs, and you don't get that in a lot of schools that are just about making the grades, but the idea of kind of global citizenship, again, maybe part of this utopian ideal that I'm kind of striving for, is that sense that we recognize the value of our nationality, we recognize the value of our nationhood and the history of our nation, but we recognize it with an understanding, with a true understanding of how that fits into global history. Because I think sometimes the narrative is very skewed towards exceptionalism. So what makes us better than everybody else, how we've overachieved compared to kind of neighboring countries. And that's fantastic. And we have a history of amazing achievement, but we also have a history of doing some pretty horrific things. And I think the ability to negotiate that space, say, look, yes, on one hand, we have this event, and on the other hand, we have these things, and allowing our children to understand how that fits into the fabric of the world is far more powerful than saying, this is what being British means, this is what being American means, because it lends itself to that tribalism again. And Edward Said said it was talking about it in 1993, and I think it's only got worse. And without kind of pinpointing too many kind of political episodes, there's been some major political episodes recently that may have reinforced some of those ideas around nationhood, and that exceptionalism, and one-upmanship.
But that's interesting. It's because it's politicized. I mean, it is, and there is a I don't know. There's a counter narrative, isn't this? I mean, there are people who would say it's common sense to sort of accept that we're actually quite a nice country, really, and the racism might be there, but it's just a few bad apples, and look how far we've come on, and the empire. Look at all the roads and electricity they have now and stuff. I mean, they're literally people who think in those terms. How do teachers deal with that and still be sort of politically neutral? Do you think that's actually possible?
It's really hard. And, as much as I have my personal views on colonization and the empire, and, certainly being a product of those two things, kind of literally being here because it makes it a really difficult space for people like me to navigate. But I do think that we, again, come down to that disciplinary knowledge around what is truth and how do we achieve truth. And truth means examining all angles of the story. And, you see this with, the National Trust trying to kind of discuss the history and the contribution that colonization made to some of these big stately homes, and people saying, well, you can't do that. That's somehow anti-British, and, you're a traitor for doing so. But it really is, again, like I said, expanding the boundaries of our knowledge so that we get to make informed choices. And as teachers, we have to allow our children to make informed choices, which means we cannot be told, do not say the empire was a bad thing. Because for lots of people, the murdered, the enslaved, the kind of the indentured servant, they were bad things. And if I said anything else, I would be lying. So, and I'm not about to stand there and say that, but I recognise people are scared because there are some quite kind of big narratives around it and big voices around it. But I think that when you try and find the truth of a subject, you'll start to select your material according to that. And that's the only advice I can give. I'm not going to go and tell people to kind of stand on a table and like decry the empire, but I do want them to interrogate it according to the discipline, according to the needs of their subject.
Absolutely. I mean, this is where I think head leaders need to help, because I mean, this comes up on the debate around, most recently, obviously, just around women feeling safe and everyday sexism and worse, but also earlier this year to do with transgender rights and identity. And I do have a worry for, say, a youngish teacher who may be political in one way or another, being faced with teenagers with attitude, rightly so, and not knowing what to say because the school hasn't quite said, helped them to formulate a kind of, here's how to lay it out, here's how to share perspectives, and here's how to kind of be yourself without kind of being in conflict with your students or biased against them or something. It does need a lot of thought, doesn't it? I mean, and I think teachers need to feel part of a system which allows them to express these ideas. And there's a lot of different lines of it as well, which don't always intersect. I mean, is that something you talk about in your trust, Emma, do you think?
I was just thinking about it's not just about the curriculum and about the students. It's about knowing your community that you're serving, what the attitudes may be and the experiences may be in the community. And I'm just thinking about something that you said about where I was ahead, large kind of markety town, all very white, not middle class at all, kind of working class. And I discovered it was the highest polling ward in the country for the BNP. And it's like, as a head teacher, you can't ignore that. You can't just say, I'm just going to plough on with my lovely curriculum that I've planned. You have to be responsive to that and sort of and put questions in your curriculum and activities in your curriculum. So when you think about how big it's about having that curriculum, but also then that vigilance as well to what's going on in your school, in your community, nationally, internationally, and being responsive to that. So yeah, I mean, our trust are doing a lot of work on kind of a core curriculum, but also a very responsive curriculum to match the needs of the communities that we serve. So yeah, I was just thinking about that really, about the importance of vigilance in all of this work. It's not a box ticking exercise, is it, Benny? It's not right. I've had this conversation. We've made this curriculum. We've ensured that we've got this policy. We're done. It's that.
Definitely not. I think, and I was going to kind of use your Matt as an example of like how to create that safe space, because that conversation has happened at Matt level, executive level, around what the values of the Multi-Academy Trust are. That's what allows a teacher to feel safe in that space. And when I say you can't do it on your own, I think you genuinely can't do it on your own. You can make small steps, but the risk factors are there, and people do need to feel safe to do this work. So where I've had large Mats come to me and say, can you train 32 schools? That's what fills me. That's the structural change that we need. Actually at that executive level, people saying, no, these are the values that we want to show. And it comes down to values. And I think we can pitch that as, look, actually, not only are we exemplifying British values in doing this, but we're also upholding the Equality Act. And those two bits of information, I think, are the most powerful levers for convincing people that we are doing the right thing as well. Look, actually, no, it literally says this is what our values are as a nation, and the law says it as well. So, we have a responsibility, and I think individual teachers can take that and use that as a tool in itself. That if anyone came to them and said, why are you choosing to teach that? Well, actually, I think it upholds British values, and here's the Equality Act as well. So I do think reach out, though. If you are doing it on your own, reach out. There's so many people doing this work. Come and talk to people, because you'll have a wealth of advice out there.
And in your
I think it's
sorry, Tom, that section at the end where it says sources of support, I think that's an absolute gold mine of support for teachers, to actually know where to go to help have the conversations, to help scaffold the change. I think the last little section in there is a real gem, Benny.
Thank you.
No, it is, and this is why it's so important to have well, for you to be doing the work that you're doing, and also I think it's great that you're doing it in your actual school and so on. And there's so many levels, aren't there? There's the values, the attitudes, there's the curriculum as it's enacted, there's the attitudes of the children changing over time and teachers. It's a fascinating space, and it's very, very, it's complicated, but it's kind of dynamic, and it has a certain sense of urgency. I feel like every couple of months a new wave hits us with like, it's so important, it's so important.
Yeah.
But we could talk all night, but I have to stop. I think honestly, it really is an honor to talk to you. I love talking to you. You're so passionate and knowledgeable, and you make it feel like I said at the beginning, important but manageable. And I think encourages people to buy into it, and it's just totally inspiring. So thank you so much for talking to us today.
You're welcome.
And everyone who hasn't got this book, Diversity in Schools, read it. But also, Milton Walkthroughs 2 has got a very special walkthrough from Bennie Kara in there, which is a very punchy 5-step guide to diversification in the curriculum and utilising diversity. So thank you very much once again, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me and Emma, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you.